We are very happy to have you in the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law Under Extreme Conditions seminar, and we are more happy that our speaker today will be Dr. Maya Mark, who was a postdoc at the Minerva Center from 2016 to 2018. Previous that, she acquired skills as a lawyer and as a historian, doing legal history and political history. And Maya now is a faculty member at the Ben-Gurion Research Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism at Ben-Gurion University. And we are very happy to have her today with us. Last week, we talked a little bit about theory of the rule of law under extreme conditions. Today, Maya will talk about Israeli practice, the cascading crisis of the COVID and political turmoil. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eli. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. It always feels like coming home. And I'll always have a very, very warm place in my heart for this center and for the people in it. So thank you very much for the invitation. And today I aim to explore a compelling case study of cascading crises, the interplay between a public health emergency and a severe political crisis. Specifically, we will examine how the coronavirus pandemic, when coupled with the political crisis in Israel, has magnified threats to democratic governance. This analysis serves as a framework for understanding cascading crises and emergencies, integrating theoretical foundations, empirical evidence, and practical implications, with a particular focus on their impact on democracy. Okay, so let us begin with the broader theoretical context. Emergencies inherently grant governments extraordinary powers, often bypassing regular legislative processes and weakening institutional checks and balances. This broad discretion, while intended to ensure efficiency and effective response, opens a dangerous door: the potential for abuse of power. Governments may exploit emergency circumstances, not only to address immediate crises, but also to pursue unrelated political goals. These actions pose a serious threat to democratic principles and human rights. Now, the question arises, why are politically motivated actions during emergencies more dangerous than errors in judgments or overreactions? And I will argue that they are indeed. So there are several answers to this question. Politically driven emergency measures frequently target specific groups, turning the weight of the state against particular segments of society. Unlike errors in judgment, which may be recognized and corrected by the executive branch itself, politically motivated measures are often deliberate, making reversal highly unlikely. When emergency measures are strategically employed to weaken institutional checks and balances, the potential for their reversal diminishes further. This dynamic heightens the vulnerability of other branches of governments to executive overreach, shifting the balance of power and undermining the democratic framework. In such cases, emergency measures cease to be tools designed for crisis management and instead become mechanisms for achieving political objectives. The implications of politically motivated actions during emergencies are therefore severe and multidimensional. The canonical starting point for discussions on the politicization of emergencies has, for over a century now, remained Carl Schmitt's political theory. Schmitt argued that emergencies are, by definition, matters of political discretion, beyond the complete reach of the legal constraints. His critique of legal liberalism rested on its naive assumptions that law can fully regulate politics, particularly in moments of emergencies. While Schmidt's work is controversial, given its association with authoritarian ideologies, it highlights a critical point. Emergencies amplify the discretionary power of the executive, creating an environment ripe for abuse of power. So from a theoretical perspective, we can identify two key challenges associated with emergency governments. The first is discretionary judgment. Emergencies often require decision makers to exercise discretion when determining whether an emergency should be declared. For example, the declaration of a war might encompass a broad spectrum of scenarios, from an existential threat to a localized conflict. Similarly, discretionary judgment extends to the measures adopted during an emergency. For instance, banning protests during a pandemic involves a subjective choice that balances public health concerns against the right to free expression. These discretionary decisions, by their nature, create significant room for interpretation and potentially misuse. The second challenge pertains to predefining standards. Emergencies are inherently exceptional, sudden, and dynamic events, making it difficult to establish predefined standards for managing them. The unpredictable and fluid nature of emergencies often forces governments to act swiftly and adaptively. However, this flexibility also increases the risk of overreach. Without clear guidelines or limitations, emergency measures can easily be shaped to serve political purposes rather than addressing the actual crisis. Together, these challenges create a dangerous dynamic in which governments may exploit emergency powers to achieve political goals. Under the pretense of responding to extraordinary circumstances, governments might erode human rights, undermine democratic institutions, and consolidate power. In extreme cases, such actions could even lead to political coups or the systematic weakening of checks and balances. But how does this dynamic unfold in practice? To address this question, I turn to Israel as a case study, focusing on a scenario where the COVID-19 crisis cascaded with an ongoing political crisis, creating a complex intersection of political motivations and crisis management. Two key decisions made in Israel during the COVID-19 pandemic illustrate these dynamics. The first was the Knesset Speaker's decision to limit parliamentary activity. The second decision was the government's decision to restrict public demonstrations. Both decisions were highly controversial and fueled suspicions of being driven by political motivations rather than solely public health concerns. Let us start with a short background. The outbreak of the coronavirus converged with a period of severe political instability in Israel, amplifying the challenges of governments and crisis management. In the year leading up to the pandemic, Israel experienced 3 rounds of elections, leaving the country under the leadership of a transitional government. During this same year, an indictment was filed against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on charges of corruption, with his criminal trial scheduled to begin on March 17, 2020. These developments further heightened tensions and polarized the political landscape. Although the political crisis predated the coronavirus outbreak, it significantly shaped the way the health crisis was managed. Decisions regarding public health measures, governments, and broader response to the pandemic were linked to the political context, raising questions about the interplay between crisis management and political motivations. This convergence of crisis serves as a compelling case study for examining how external emergencies can intersect with internal political challenges, with profound implications for democracy and governments. Following Israel's third election on March 2nd, 2020, the mandate to form a government was given to MK Benny Gantz, marking a pivotal moment in the ongoing political crisis. With the political landscape deeply divided, Gantz's bloc sought to advance legislation that would prevent an indictment member of Knesset from serving as prime minister, and that was a move directly targeting Netanyahu, who was under indictment at the time. One potential way to prevent this legislative initiative would therefore be to limit Knesset activity, and this is precisely what soon occurred. However, the rationale for this action was framed as an emergency measure necessitated by the coronavirus crisis. This development brought the question of whether we were witnessing the politicization of an emergency to the forefront, sparking intense debate and raising concerns about the intersection of public health crisis and political maneuvering. On March 16, 2020, the Knesset was sworn in. The newly sworn-in Knesset sought to elect a new speaker as part of its broader strategy to implement legislative measures targeting Netanyahu. However, this effort was met with resistance from the incumbent speaker, MK Yuli Edelstein, a member of Netanyahu's party. Edelstein rejected the majority's demand to proceed with the election of a new speaker, effectively blocking the initiative and stalling the legislative process. Edelstein justified his actions by pointing to the state of emergency caused by the coronavirus outbreak. He argued that the public health crisis requires stability and continuity in leadership, framing his decision as a necessary response to the emergency rather than a political determination. On March 18, Speaker Yuli Edelstein exercised his authority to restrict Knesset activity by prohibiting gathering of more than 10 people. This decision effectively curtailed parliamentary operations during a critical moment of national crisis, sparking intense debate about its motivations and implications. Edelstein's action was particularly controversial given that it contradicted guidance from the Director General of the Ministry of Health. The health official explicitly stated that the gathering restrictions imposed due to the coronavirus outbreak did not apply to the Knesset, recognizing the essential nature of parliamentary functions in a democratic system. Speaker Yuli Edelstein defended his decision to restrict Knesset activity as a necessary step in light of the state of emergency brought on by the coronavirus pandemic. According to Edelstein, the unprecedented public health crisis demanded swift and decisive actions to ensure the safety of those involved in parliamentary proceedings. However, members of the center-left bloc strongly opposed this rationale, accusing Edelstein of exploiting the emergency for political ends. They argued that under the pretense of combating the coronavirus, these measures were being cynically used to undermine democratic processes and protect the political interests of Prime Minister Netanyahu. This clash of perspective highlighted deep divisions within the Knesset, further complicating an already charged political environment. At the heart of this controversy lies the critical question: how can we distinguish between genuinely essential measures in time of emergency and the exploitation of those same measures for political gain? The discretionary nature of such decision makes this distinction inherently subjective and deeply political. Edelstein's actions prompted petitions to the Supreme Court, asserting that his decision to restrict Knesset activity constituted a violation of democratic principles. In response, the Supreme Court issued a decisive ruling. Edelstein was ordered to convene the Knesset plenary and hold a vote to elect a new speaker within 48 hours. As the deadline approached, Edelstein took an unprecedented step. On the morning the deadline was set to expire, he announced his resignation as speaker and informed the Attorney General that he had no intention of including the election of a new speaker on the Knesset's agenda. This deliberate defiance of the Supreme Court's ruling marked a dramatic escalation of the crisis. On May 25th, the Supreme Court issued a landmark decision to address the defiance of its earlier ruling. The court instructed the oldest member of the Knesset to convene the plenary the following day, ensuring compliance with the judicial order to elect a new speaker. This move underscored the court's determination to uphold the rule of law and restore the functioning of Israel's democratic institutions. In its decision, the Supreme Court expressed profound concern over the unprecedented nature of the defiance. The ruling noted, "Never before in the history of the state has a governmental authority openly and defiantly refused to comply with the judicial order, claiming that their conscience prevents them from upholding the court's ruling." This powerful statement reflected the gravity of the situation, emphasizing that such defiance posed a direct challenge to the foundational principles of the rule of law and the separation of powers. The second decision I would like to explore through the lens of Cascading Crises is the Israeli government's decision to restrict protests during the COVID-19 pandemic. This decision, much like the restriction of Knesset activity, must be understood within its specific factual and political context. Starting in March 2020, Israel witnessed a growing wave of public demonstrations directed against the government. At the heart of these protests was widespread opposition to the continued tenure of Prime Minister Netanyahu. These protests quickly became a focal point of political tension, reflecting deep dissatisfaction with government leadership. In May 2020, a draft of emergency legislation was introduced, sparking significant debate. The draft law granted the government sweeping powers to impose restrictions on various rights, including the right to protest, without requiring prior approval from the Knesset. This provision raised serious concerns about the potential for unchecked executive power and its implications for democratic freedoms. The proposed legislation faced substantial opposition, leading to critical revisions in the final version. Notably, the revised law excluded protests from the government's authority to impose restrictions, reflecting a compromise aimed at preserving the right to protest even during the pandemic. However, the issue resurfaced in September 2020 as the pandemic persisted and protests against the government intensified. The Attorney General, the Ministry of Health, the police, and other professional bodies collaborated to formulate a framework that set conditions and restrictions for holding protests. This proposal aimed to balance public health concerns with the fundamental right to demonstrate. Despite these efforts, the proposed framework was rejected by the coronavirus cabinet, signaling deeper political tensions surrounding this issue. The following day, the government approved an alternative framework that imposed much harsher limitations. Protests were restricted to within 1 kilometer of an individual's residence and limited to groups of no more than 20 participants. This decision marked a significant shift, raising questions about whether the restrictions were genuinely driven by public health considerations or were intended to suppress protests against the government. The amendment to the law granting the government authority to restrict protests was passed through an expedited legislative process. Immediately following its first reading in the Knesset, the bill was referred to a late-night session of the Constitution, Law and Justice Committee. This rushed process left little room for deliberation or debate. During the committee session, all objections to the amendment were dismissed. One notable proposal, to permit vehicle convoy protests as an alternative to in-person gathering, was also rejected, further fueling criticism that the amendment was designed to diminish protests altogether rather than to find a balanced solution. Later that same day, the amendment was brought back to the Knesset for final approval. It passed and came into effect the following day, reflecting the swift progression of the legislation. The amendment included a transitional provision that stipulated the specific state of emergency, allowing the prevention of protest would take immediate effect, effectively curbing public demonstrations overnight. And again, the question arises, was the decision to restrict protests during the COVID-19 pandemic driven by public health concerns, or was it a politically motivated action? Several factors suggest that this was, in fact, a political decision. The first is evidence from the government meetings. Discussions among government's ministers revealed a direct focus on political protests against the Prime Minister. Some ministers explicitly requested an examination of ways to restrict these demonstrations, indicating that political motivations have played a significant role in shaping the decision. This evidence suggests that the protests, rather than public health considerations, were a central concern. A second indication is a flawed decision-making process. The process through which this decision was made further undermines its legitimacy. The expedited legislative process and the dismissal of objections or alternative proposals reflected a lack of transparency and deliberation. Perhaps most tellingly, the decision was made contrary to the recommendations of professional experts, including those from the Ministry of Health. These experts had proposed a more balanced framework for protests, one that would address public health concerns while preserving the right to protest. The government's rejection of these recommendations suggests that other factors, potentially political, were prioritized. Finally, the discussion surrounding the decision centered not on infection data or any empirical factual basis, but on the protests themselves. The lack of a clear connection between the restrictions and public health outcomes further supports the argument that the measures were politically driven rather than evidence-based. Together, these elements present a compelling case that the decision to restrict protest was influenced more by political considerations than by public health imperatives, raising broader concerns about the use of emergency powers. The tension between public health imperatives and democratic rights exemplifies the broader challenges posed by cascading crises. It underscores the risk of conflating legitimate emergency response with politically motivated actions. It also exemplifies how cascading crises can be leveraged to introduce measures with profound implications for democratic governance. At its core, this situation presented a stark dichotomy between the government's position and the criticism leveled against it. On one hand, the government argued that the emergency measures were essential to protect public health. Thus, restricting protest was a necessary response to curb the spread of COVID-19 and safeguard the well-being of the public. On the other hand, critics contended that the state of emergency was being used as a pretext to suppress protests targeting Netanyahu. These critics highlighted the focus on demonstrations against the Prime Minister, the deviation from expert recommendations, and the lack of empirical evidence, linking protests to significant increasing. For them, the measures represented an alarming exploitation of the public health crisis to advance political objectives and suppress opposition. So the challenge of determining whether a decision is politically motivated lie at the intersection of government's discretion and democratic accountability. The two cases we have explored, the restriction of Knesset activity by the speaker and the restriction of public demonstrations, highlight the complexity of navigating cascading emergencies. First, these cases demonstrate the complexity of cascading emergencies. Crises such as the COVID-19 provide governments with broad discretionary powers, which can in turn serve as pretext for undemocratic action with political motives. The overlap of public health concerns and political crises creates a gray area where the intent behind emergency measures is often difficult to discern. A central issue in these cases is discretion. The government argued in both instances that the measures taken, limiting parliamentary activity and restricting protest, were essential emergency actions necessary to protect public health. Yet, this discretion also opens the door to political exploitation. Compounding this is the lack of objective standards for evaluating such decisions. There are no universally accepted criteria to determine whether an emergency measure is proportionate, necessary, or unduly influenced by political considerations. This absence of clear benchmarks leaves much to interpretation, making it difficult to distinguish between legitimate crisis management and politically motivated actions. Finally, these issues unfold within broader political debate shaped by competing narratives. The discourse surrounding emergency measures often reflects conflicting interpretations and political positions. Supporters of the government's action frame them as necessary steps to protect the public, while critics argue that they are thinly veiled attempts to suppress dissent or consolidate power. This polarization makes it even harder to arrive at an objective assessment of such measures. The global nature of the coronavirus crisis offers a unique opportunity to rethink how emergencies are managed and to develop tools for addressing the politicization of such situations. The pandemic's worldwide scope created a shared experience of crisis management, which allow for cross-national comparisons and the development of universal principles to mitigate the misuse of emergency powers. One key question is whether the discussion around the politicization of emergencies can be extracted from its specific political, contextual, and national framework. Emergencies, by their nature, are deeply intertwined with the political and cultural dynamics of the societies in which they occur. This contextual grounding makes it challenging to develop universal standards. However, the global nature of the COVID-19 crisis provides a comparative lens, allowing scholars, policymakers, and civil society to identify patterns of abuse, best practices, and lessons learned across different jurisdictions. By examining global trends, we can identify common indicators of politicization, such as the use of vague emergency powers to target political opponents, the evasion of legislative oversight, or the suppression of civil liberties under the pretense of public health measures. International frameworks and institutions could play a role in codifying these lessons, offering guidelines and recommendations to ensure that emergency measures are proportionate, transparent, and rooted in empirical evidence. The key to combating the politicization of decision-making during emergencies lies in shifting from subjective parameters, those centers on the specific circumstances and justifications presented by governments, to objective, measurable criteria. Establishing clear standards for evaluating emergency measures can reduce the risk of political exploitation while ensuring that decisions remain grounded in transparency and accountability. Achieving this shift, however, is no small task. It requires substantial resources, expertise, and institutional infrastructure. These elements are often unavailable to those who are best positioned to challenge the misuse of emergency powers, including petitioners, legislators, and courts. Without access to robust data, independent analysis, and procedural safeguards, these actors face significant barriers in identifying and addressing politically motivated decisions. For instance, courts reviewing emergency measures may lack the knowledge or evidence necessary to evaluate the government's actions. Similarly, legislators tasked with oversight may struggle to navigate the complexity of emergency policies without adequate resources or expert input. Civil society too may find it difficult to advocate effectively without access to empirical data and technical support. Addressing these challenges requires building capacity in key areas. Investments in independent oversight bodies, research institutions, and civil society organizations can provide the necessary tools to scrutinize emergency measures effectively. International collaboration and knowledge sharing can also play a critical role, allowing actors to draw on global best practices and comparative experience. Ultimately, the creation of objective and measurable criteria for evaluating emergency decisions is essential to safeguarding democracy during crisis. A global crisis like the coronavirus pandemic offers a unique and valuable toolbox that is often unavailable during localized emergencies. The worldwide nature of the crisis enables the development of objective and comparative metrics that can be used to evaluate specific decisions made by individual states. This global perspective allows for the identification of patterns, best practices, and deviation that might indicate the politicization of emergency measures. By benchmarking decisions against these metrics, it becomes easier to assess whether the government's actions are truly necessary for addressing the crisis. Comparative evaluations reduce the likelihood of government exploiting emergency powers, as actions can be measured against broader, evidence-based standards that transcend local political context. This approach constitutes a powerful tool for various actors in the democratic system. Petitioners can rely on comparative data to strengthen legal challenges against suspected abuse of power. Parliamentarians can use international benchmarks to hold governments accountable and demand transparency. Courts can draw on global precedents and metrics to evaluate whether emergency measures are proportionate, necessary, and justified. The availability of these tools transforms the way emergencies are managed and scrutinized, empowering those who seek to safeguard democracy during crisis. By leveraging global insights, actors at all levels can challenge decisions suspected of being politically motivated, ensuring that emergency powers are used responsibly and in service of the public good, rather than political interests. This globalized approach to accountability represents a critical step forward in addressing the risks associated with cascading emergencies in this case. So the application of a global toolbox to evaluate the decision to limit Knesset activity, and now I'm going back to the first case study, and it provides a compelling example of how objective and comparative metrics can challenge the justification for emergency measures. At the time the decision was made, the coronavirus crisis in Israel was not as severe as in many other countries. Comparatively, in most countries, parliaments continued to function with little to no disruption, adapting procedures to address health concerns without halting legislative activity. This global context immediately calls into question the necessity of significantly limiting the Knesset's operation. Additionally, the average age of Knesset members in Israel was 51.96, well below the age group defined as being at the highest risk for severe COVID-19 complications. This demographic factor suggests that health risk to members of Knesset were not as pronounced as might have been the case in other legislative bodies with older average ages. Furthermore, the Knesset itself is smaller than most parliaments, with only 120 members. This limited size inherently reduces the potential for widespread transmission compared to larger assemblies. Together, all these factors point to a significantly lower risk environment within the Israeli legislature compared to many international counterparts. The availability of empirical and comparative data on these points provides a critical tool for evaluating the government's justification for limiting Knesset activity. This analysis leads to the conclusion that the coronavirus crisis alone does not fully explain or justify the restrictions imposed. Instead, it raises the question of whether political motives played a role in the decision-making process, particularly given the concurrent political crisis and its implications for democratic governance. The application of global data and comparative metrics also provides valuable insights into Israel's decision to restrict protests during the coronavirus pandemic. This decision stands out as particularly severe when evaluated against the practices of other democratic countries. Notably, in no democratic country worldwide was the right to protest completely banned during the pandemic. While restrictions on the size of gathering and social distancing were implemented in many nations, the outright prohibition of protests, as seen in Israel, was unprecedented. This comparative context immediately raised questions about the proportionality and necessity of Israel's measures. Further evidence comes from a comprehensive study conducted in the United States, which analyzed COVID-19 infection data from 315 cities where protests occurred. That was the period of the huge demonstrations of Black Lives Matter. The study concluded that in the vast majority of these cities, there was no increase in infection rates among the general population or among protesters. These findings suggest that outdoor protests, when managed responsibly, do not necessarily pose a significant public health risk. Additionally, the Knesset itself sought information from approximately 24 countries to understand their approaches to managing protest and the associated infection risks. The data collected confirmed that Israel's restriction on the right to protest were unique and very exceptional. While other nations implemented measures to balance public health with the right to demonstrate, Israel's approach stood out for its restrictive nature. So the availability of comparative and empirical data played a critical role in enabling various actors to challenge the Israeli government's decision to restrict protests during the coronavirus crisis. Petitioners, media outlets, members of Knesset, civil society organizations, and courts all relied on this data to scrutinize the government actions and question their legitimacy. Armed with this evidence, petitioners brought cases to the courts, arguing that the government's restrictions on protests were disproportionate and unjustified. Media outlets amplified these critiques, shedding light on the unique nature of Israel's measures and highlighting the lack of a solid public health rationale. Members of Knesset and civil society used civil society organizations used the data to demand greater accountability and transparency, arguing that the measures undermined democratic principles and violated the fundamental right to protest. In both cases, the decision to limit Knesset activity and the restriction of protests, the availability of empirical data, served as a critical foundation for evaluating the government's actions. This empirical foundation transformed the nature of the decision, enabling decisions made within a specific political and domestic context to be assessed using objective tools. By grounding the evaluation in facts, the reliance on empirical data shifted the discourse, and that's a really important point. It shifted the discourse from a narrative-based debate shaped by conflicting political interpretations to one rooted in measurable evidence. This approach allowed courts, petitioners, media outlets, and civil society organizations to challenge the government's claims and demonstrates inconsistencies between the stated public health justifications and the actual measures implemented. Moreover, the data facilitated an analysis of the decisions within their broader context, revealing that the underlying motivations were political rather than purely driven by public health concerns. In the case of restricting Knesset activity, comparative data showed that parliamentary functions continued elsewhere under similar or even more severe health conditions, undermining claims that such drastic measures were indeed necessary. Similarly, in the case of the protests, evidence from international studies and practices revealed that protest poses no significant public health risk, further challenging the rationale behind Israel's unequally restrictive approach. The global state of emergency brought on by the coronavirus crisis has provided valuable insights into both the theoretical and practical dimension of cascading crisis. Beyond its immediate challenges, this unprecedented event offers a unique opportunity to develop a significant toolbox to address and combat the politicization of emergencies worldwide. One of the most critical contributions of this global perspective is the creation of an empirical foundation that allows discussions to transcend localized political and narrative debates. By employing objective metrics and comparative data, decisions can be assessed with greater accuracy and accountability. This toolbox also facilitates critical inquiry into two key areas. First, it allows for the evaluation of emergency models in different countries. Did the existing emergency frameworks, such as emergency constitutions, formal declarations, or perpetual states of emergency, did they prove more or less prone to abuse of power? Comparative analysis can shed light on whether certain models are more resilient to politicization and identify best practices for reform. Second, it highlights structural weaknesses exposed by the global emergency. Did the pandemic reveal systematic vulnerabilities in the governments that threaten democracy and make states susceptible to the misuse of emergency powers? These insights can guide efforts to fortify institutions, improve accountability mechanism, and reduce the likelihood of future abuse during crisis. In conclusion, the global state of emergency has underscored the importance of objective analysis and comparative frameworks in safeguarding democracy. By leveraging this new toolbox, we can better navigate the complexity of cascading crises, ensuring that emergency powers are used responsibly and do not become instruments of political exploitation. This approach offers a pathway to strengthen governments, protect human rights, and uphold the rule of law in an increasingly interconnected world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. It was fascinating, and the floor is open for questions, remarks. Yes, Benny.
Hi, Maya.
Hi, Benny.
Fascinating. I mean, I think all of us going through the pandemic had this feeling that someone has to write this. Um, but anyway, I wanted to just to examine one major assumption is that you distinguish between the emergency powers and political driven use of those powers. And the question, not all. The definition. Used the term political. I would say maybe used a different definition because political powers, the use of political powers is not something not legitimate for a government to do. I mean, government, that's what they are elected to do. They were elected to use political powers. I mean, maybe you're referring to the problem of you exploiting emergency powers for non-emergency use. Okay. Or maybe you have an issue regarding using governmental power to undermine democratic use. Let's say your two main examples, the protests and the parliament convents. So those, you can define those as the illegitimate use of governmental powers. But I'm not sure your definition as just using the use of using government powers for political purposes is not legitimate. I would say they need some refinement there.
Okay, so thank you for this comment. Let me ask you a question. If the word would shift to an instrumentalization, would that solve your, is that a comment on terminology? Because the point of departure was the political theory of Schmitt and all the theories that, apologies for my throat, and all the political thinkers that followed him, and the term politicization of emergency, or the concern of politicization of emergency, is very commonly used in literature. The distinction, substantially, the distinction is between politically motivated decisions and decisions that are a necessity, that are driven from the emergency conditions. But I'm very happy to think of the terminology again, and thank you for that.
I think the correction of Benny doesn't really change the thesis. You know, if you don't use political consideration, but you use misuse of extreme
misuse of power, or
other non-extreme driven objectives, that's a neutral language. Sasha.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting to perceive afresh the sequence of events, in fact, that you presented in a very close way. I have a single question, because obviously the point of cascading is not just to say that there is an instrumentalization or a politicization of health crisis, a public health crisis. The point that you want to make is more than that. But my first question is, I don't know how, I didn't really understand, but this is my own fault. What is more than just a politicization of a health crisis in what you presented, or how you would characterize that? And then my second remark may in fact be an answer to this first question, in the sense that there is something very particular in the COVID crisis, which may be very dissimilar to other emergency crises. What is very particular in that crisis is that the very crisis itself touches upon the fact that people are together in the street, or in the parliament. So it really attains the idea of togetherness, of being together and forming a people, in fact, forming a demos. So there is something very particular in that crisis, I would say, that is already, in a sense, something that affects democracy in its very basic organization, that the fact that we can be together. So now my question about the politicization of this crisis, which is the answer to my first question, in fact, would be the fact that given the nature of that crisis and given the nature of the emergency that becomes necessary, there is almost cynically by necessity, consequences on democratic life itself. But the cascading effect comes from the very nature of the crisis itself, not only from the politicization of that crisis. I hope I make sense and that you can address this particular point.
This is a very interesting perspective. I generally thank you for this comment. I think it's very insightful.
Thank you. Thank you. Because it is an aspect that I mean that has to be taken also into account in a model, in a more general model. Which crisis affects already democracy than other crises? Yeah.
What you're basically arguing is that if we are looking structurally on democracy, there is something about the COVID that distinguishes for example, from an earthquake, or it's something very unique to pandemic, and it affects certain characteristics of democracy, and there is inherently a challenge there because of the specific nature of the pandemic that prevents people from getting together.
Exactly. So it makes
That's a very interesting point.
It makes the politicization of the crisis even easier because of that, unlike other crises.
It's a very good argument. It's a very, very good argument. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Maya, for your talk.
Thank you. It's very insightful.
Sasha, what is the uniqueness of a pandemic?
This uniqueness is that it affects what I call togetherness. The fact that you have a democratic expression by the pandemic itself is affected because now
major earthquake will affect this, kind of make the same effect of.
Not in the same way, I would say. Not in the same way, because, for instance, we have something in a island in the ocean. In the Indian Ocean those days, a big hurricane that destroyed everything. And what you observe in that case is the possibility of solidarity between people, which is, I would say, another way of reorganizing the social bounds. What happened with the COVID is precisely that the crisis itself almost destroyed those social bonds.
It goes to the very definition of democracy and what it takes to implement democracy. And if you understand democracy as solidarity or something that requires, it's a very big question, by the way, does it actually require the physical connection between human beings? I don't know. And I don't know what it's going to look like in 200 years if there still be a liberal democracies anywhere. But let's put that aside for a second. It doesn't look very, very promising right now. But say there is. We can't predict technological developments. Universities may cease to exist. We may all just sit in our little cubicles, and that would be our only connection to people. Does that necessarily mean that this is not a democracy? I'm not sure. I mean, I can see your point, and I think it's a very, very interesting point. I think it goes to the way you understand democracy, the conditioning underlining it, and our possibility to implement it. And does it actually require us to be together?
Not necessarily, but I mean the fact that we are used to this togetherness does not necessarily destroy democracy in itself, but it made it easier for taking anti-democratic measure.
That's a different argument, which is
another argument.
It says
that's another argument. Yes, you're right.
So it shakes something in the structure of society and the connection between people and makes it even more vulnerable.
Yeah. Great. Let's move on to Danielle and then Danielle.
Okay. I am I the first Danielle or?
Yes,
Okay. Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much, Maya. This was very interesting, and you were very convincing that this was an important point, important issue to address, and that deserves it deserves more attention. What I was less convinced about was your actual arguments. When your argument about protests, what would have made it more convincing to me is had you compared it to the decision-making process with regards to restrictions of other freedoms, like religious freedoms and economic freedoms, because maybe the government decision-making processes were all sloppy, and it wasn't specifically unique to protests. If you had compared it to policies that the government had no political interest in promoting, I would have found it more convincing. I guess it's kind of like a quasi-control within your analysis. Also, the comparison to international, when you compare the international, the policies in other international and parliaments internationally, I also found this rather unconvincing because the policy environments in different countries varied significantly, and Israel took a rather extreme approach in Corona by restricting all international flight at certain points, general lockdowns where people are restricted to certain meters within their house, a certain amount of meters from their house, were also more conservative and more extreme than measures taken in other countries. So also it was not convincing to me that this was something unique to the parliament and politically motivated based on that evidence alone. And then I think that the idea of making objective standards or an objective toolbox with which to analyze policies is an interesting one. I question whether it's really whether it's something that we can actually do, and whether that's something we can achieve. I'm not sure. You looked at empirical data with regard. You had a section where you spoke about empirical data with regards to protests and Corona, and suggested comparing the policies to empirical data. Now it's kind of like we forgot the chronology here, though, because the empirical data only came out much after the decision-making processes. And that's characteristic of crises, where crises are characterized by uncertainty, by novel situations, and by lack of data. And oftentimes the time it takes to put together the data is far after the political decision-making happens. So I'm not sure that that's a practical thing to do, and I'm not sure that doing so is a good way to assess whether retroactively decisions were made with decisions were politically motivated or not. Because if the politicians don't have access to that data, I'm not sure that we can use that as a benchmark for assessment.
Thank you. Retaining your first comment about looking at the implementation of emergency measures in Israel in other fields, like I think you said freedom of religion and other fields. So I think, well, I'll answer it on two levels. First of all, I think you compare apples to apples and you don't compare apples to pears. I mean, if you look at analytically, if you look at protests, so you need to look at protests in Israel and then compare it to protests in other countries. But substantially, I think I don't know if it's interesting. Did someone actually wrote about it? But if an analysis would have been made, we all know that there was no enforcement of synagogues and schools in religious neighborhoods, and there was such a big difference in implementation in different places that I'm quite sure it would only strengthen the argument. But the thing that I tried to do and to argue is it's not something about Israel. I mean, the whole point is not to do exactly the thing that we're doing. It's to extract the whole discourse from a particular political context and an argument between political narratives in a very, very polarized society that has very high level of hostility and distrust, to extract it from there and to just search for criteria that are as measurable as possible and objective as possible, and not to look at how was the COVID-19 policy implicated on Tel Aviv and how was it implicated on Bnei Brak. That's not what I wanted to say. That's easy. We do it every day in every aspect. But I
don't think that's what I'm trying to say, Maya, just so you understand. I'm saying that you lack a control. I'm saying that comparing the same policies to other countries, it doesn't, without taking into account their policy environments in general, with regards to COVID, doesn't convince me that there was something unusual about how Israel addressed protests. However, taking a control measure, taking a control for like a government policy that they had no political interest in promoting, however, and looking at the decision making for that type of policy compared to something that is in their political interest to promote, which would be like an experimental group and a control group, let's say, that would be more convincing. I will, on the side, without getting into debate about it, object wholeheartedly to what you said about what happened in Haredi areas during COVID. I think that displays significant ignorance with regards to what occurred in religious communities. But without getting into that, really, I'm just talking about the need for control.
Okay. So I would also like to correct you on one thing. There was empirical data. At real time, there were, I can't remember if it was Chicago or maybe Ellie remembers, there was a lot of money going into research institutions, and teams of scholars were joining forces to create databases in real time. I remember, I still have it. I can send you the reference. Tom Ginsburg, perhaps? What was the name of this scholar from, I think it was from Harvard? They published...
Tom Ginsburg from Chicago, but it was also, when you talk about the parliamentary crisis was in the second month of the pandemic, and there was no data then. And the protest thing is a little bit later. So every minute of time here is very important in this sense. I think that Daniel has an important point, because the harsher measures taken by Israel from the very beginning can explain the difference. And in a sense, your argument is cyclic, in the sense that, that you say other parliaments were much more affected, or other countries are much more affected, and they didn't take these measures. And the argument is exactly the opposite. We took very harsh measures that extended also to parliaments and demonstration. But let's move on, because there are many people who want to speak. Daniel.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much. This is really interesting. I really appreciated all of this. So my question has to do with translating objective criteria into practical action, especially in a politicized or polarized context. And so, I'm thinking about here in the States, masks became so politicized so quickly. How do you, even if you have objective criteria, and even if you have it early on in a crisis, how do you encourage public buy-in in a country that's so polarized, whether it's Israel or the US, where it's ripe for misinformation? I was also thinking about the role of misinformation here, or disinformation, technology, social media, the role that these play in these kinds of conversations. And so I think that I would be curious to hear more about, in Israel, we talked about the protesters, and who sort of naturally, chafed at these restrictions. But what about, the pro-Netanyahu or the Likud bloc in Israel? I mean, how were these measures received by them? Were they accepted as fact? Is it possible to convince a Netanyahu voter to change their views because of objective, scientific, empirical data? And so I think maybe this question also has to do with emotion. I mean, you mentioned narrative, but also emotion, pre-existing political views and biases. I mean, how do we account for all of these things? So I can leave it at that, but thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, you're asking, that's the question, I think, not only concerning emergencies or cascading emergencies. What you're asking me, I think, if I understood you correctly, is how do we go back, or how do we turn to a fact-based discourse? How do we convince people? How do we turn to rationality? How do we do it in a post-truth era? And that's a question that's much broader than our business here, which is quite big on its own. But, we don't need to go far. Just go to the first Trump campaign, go to the second Trump campaign. I don't need to tell you that there are millions of Americans that are still convinced that whatever happened there with Hillary Clinton in the basement with the pizza and all these conspiracy theories, and that happens worldwide, and that's a much broader question relating to behavioral psychology and politics and digital and the social networks. And that's, I think, our biggest challenge of our time. Sometimes I'm actually just writing something about it. We can see, I'm going to make an implication on what we're dealing here now within Israel with the attempt to demolish Israeli democracy. And sometimes the discourse reminds me of like the Orwellian doublespeak equation. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? It's like when you say something and you frame it in a certain way, but you mean something completely different, or the other way around. And what I mean to say is that when someone says, my policy is aimed to strengthen separation of power in a country, but in reality, what he does is the completely opposite thing. So we are dealing with questions of the meaning of words, of terminologies, of sometimes just straightforward lies. I mean, there are things that are a question of opinions and political ideologies and conflicting ideologies, and that's one thing. But there are things that are fact related. And I don't have a very good answer to this, but I do think that that's the only thing we've got. I mean, if we say that truth doesn't matter and facts doesn't matter and science doesn't matter, and on a very, abstract level, my only answer to you is that countries need to invest a lot in a good public education system that will teach people critical thinking and the importance, or even give them the tools to identify facts and to distinguish between lies and truth. And that's the best answer I can give. I really think it's the only answer. It's what happens in Israel, it's what happens in the state.
I think that Daniel's point reveals a very interesting difference between Israel and the US. Because in the COVID time, there was no skepticism in Israel, real skepticism about science.
Yes.
And the whole issue in the US was the politicization of the scientific, this is not, it's very interesting to compare conspiracy theories about 7th of October, which in Israel are very, very common, and no conspiracy theories about, the scientific care in COVID. And this is a very interesting difference, which requires further thought. We are very short on time, so we'll give Fadi, Stephanie, and Nadiv the floor for comments and questions, and then Maya will answer them together. Fadi.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Maya, for the presentation. I also think we need to recognize the challenge of generalizing from a very specific period to a more general theory about intersecting or cascading emergencies. What I think might be missing, not just in this comparison, but more generally, is the political sociology of emergencies more generally, and how it intersects with the cleavage structure in a given society, the political cleavages, social cleavages. So to me, I can't but think about the protest issue and the reactions within different kind of authorities, whether the more interventionist attitudes by the courts compared to, for example, the post October 7th policies about protests, which is another kind of emergency that's intersecting with a political emergency, and the different communities within Israel that kind of constitute different social cleavages as well. You can see different scopes of tolerance for protests and demonstrations, but also substance and content-based attitudes, and the way the courts even were willing to intervene. You can see some differences. So I think the political sociology of emergencies and how different emergencies might have different camps, so to speak, how this intersects would be an interesting question to pose. Obviously, I don't have any answers to that at this point. And yes, maybe an anecdote, being somebody who actually worked on one of the petitions against the framework coronavirus law. It's interesting to see how the coalition that enacted that law and the opposition at that period of time was basically the ruling coalition, the next elections, like the Bennett-Lapid government. So those parties, when they were sitting in the opposition, were very critical of the law, and the amount of comments they introduced against the law were almost unprecedented until the reasonableness law. But then when they came to be the ruling coalition, they did not only, repeal that law, but used it and continued to work with those powers that they thought were exceedingly undemocratic at the time. So this kind of difference point of view from being in the ruling party versus being in the opposition, and how you can evaluate certain measures under emergencies, is another point which is worthy of consideration when we're talking about overreach, in my opinion. So,
thanks, Stephanie.
Oh, thank you. I think that you already put something that I would like to say, because I'm from Brazil. I'm talking from Brazil, and we have contacts during the pandemic very next to the United States situation. And for us, the way to make protest was to stay at home, because the government sent us to the street to work, just like the virus or the pandemic do not exist. So we have a wave of conspiracy theories, a lot of regress in public politics. So for me, your presentation, thank you a lot, Maya, was very interesting, because I start to think about the Brazilian situation. That is my main object of work during the Bolsonarism, in this way, but in the very opposite way, but if the same political mobilization of the crisis, but sending the population to the street. And our form to protest was in the public sphere, not in the public space. We have a movement in Brazil that we call of stay at home, that fica em casa in Portuguese. So for me, it was very interesting. I would like to know if I made a correct association of thinking in this way. Very opposite situations, but using the same theoretical basis. Oh, thank you a lot.
Thanks.
That's interesting. Nadiv, and then Maya will respond to all of you.
And then Maya will go to pick up her kids.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to hear the comments.
So I will make it short because I have a kid to pick up as well. First of all, thank you. And I think that narratively speaking, I'm fully agreed with what you presented. And I think that one can definitely argue that the Corona crisis was a catalyst for the continuation of the Netanyahu abuse of the Israeli democracy. That said, I want to pick up Daniel and maybe Fadi's comments on a more methodological level. I ask myself when we are researching the interplays between emergencies and other crises, how can we need to approach the problem? And I think that your approach is quite standard in the literature, me myself included, and that is to try to investigate the most salient cases in which anti-democratic measures were implemented. And in your take was about the political crisis with Yuli Edelstein decision, which was a stricto sensu constitutional crisis, extremely salient, and also the demonstrations and the demonstration restriction, which you analyze in kind of an idiosyncratic manner without addressing, as Daniel said, to across-the-board restriction of human rights in a comparatively analysis. And in my current view, so first of all, I took part in that kind of analysis when I was in the Israel Democracy Institute, and it's important. I would just mention one caveat, and that is that I'm not sure that those are kind of an interesting fora to investigate, because as we know, even without extreme condition, the baseline condition in Israel is that parliament is basically an ineffective institution in terms of oversighting the executive, even in normal times, even without Corona, even without democratic backsliding. So I don't know why that is kind of, an important story. And even the question of protecting the freedom of speech and demonstration is something that relatively is in Israel is in a decline much before the Corona crisis. So that brings me to my thoughts on current times about the way we need to investigate and treat the question of how one crisis affect the other, and that is not to investigate the most salient performative episodes that were related to democratic infringement measures, but to try to think maybe in what Fadi's was mentioning or thinking about the more deeper political sociology of crisis management and the way this can utilize authoritarianism. So a couple of examples that I want to mention in the Corona crisis, I think are more relevant for our quest towards cascading crises than the parliament or the demonstrations. So first is, for example, the difference between politics of solidarity and the politics of fear. I think that one salient element of the way Netanyahu managed the Corona crisis was by the politics of fear, and we see that as something that is going on deeper, even even after the corona crisis. The second element, once again, in the political structure and political sociology, is the political structure of unity government as one that empowers the leader. So we saw that in the Gantz-Netanyahu government, and we saw that the same pattern in the Gaza war. And one could question if that is something that was so essential as we were told. Another thing that I can think of is the way politics mitigate the risks and the emergency measures. So we saw this culture of Netanyahu appearances to the public, and we see that as something that is going on even in the war and even after the war as something that empowers its image as an autocrat. So, and most important, and with that I will finish, I think another prominent field that we are not researching enough is not just the parliament and the courts, but the bureaucracy. What was the transformation in the bureaucracy due to the coronavirus in the health sector, in budgetary? So one example in constitutional law is the total collapse of the constitutional law of the budget in the corona crisis. Something that we are now seeing in the management of the budget in the war. So I think that there's a lot of other fora, another arenas that are not the usual suspects for our investigation of the cascading crises. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, so much for wonderful comments. I wish we could have gone on. Maybe we will have the opportunity to continue this fascinating discussion. Unfortunately, I have 4 minutes to get to 2 different places, and I don't want my kids to be left outside. Luckily, I live in a very small place, so I think 4 minutes will be enough. Thank you very much. You gave me a lot to think about.
Thank you very much, Maya, and I think that we should continue.
You can stay. I'm running, and you can stay.
No, we should continue the discussion with you in our next meeting. We'll have some time to continue because I think very, very important points were raised here. We should not be responsible for abandoning kids. So let's wrap up the meeting.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed your thoughts and